All right, y'all. Thank you for joining me in our little presentation today. My name is Jay Wilson. I'm over at Onyx Reporting. I'm a freelance database developer trainer, um, general purpose support guy for Jet Reports and Jet Reports related products. In this I guess, video today, what I kind of wanted to show you was a better way or another way of going about visualizing financial data. Now, I know many of you are not involved in, income statement reporting and that, but I think some of the stuff that I show you today is going to be relatable, provided that you're the guy in the office or the gal, the person in the office who builds reports. And a lot of times we spend a lot of time working in Excel or Power BI or Jet Reports, putting some pretty gnarly reports together. And I'm going to show you guys a better, stronger way, potentially, of getting it done. In any event, this is going to be a little bit of a lengthy process, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at kind of a truncated version of an income statement report that I built for one of my clients using the Jet Professional Excel add-on. From there, we're going to take a look at how you can recreate that report using your Jet Enterprise, Jet Data Manager, Pivot Table, and Cube solution. Once we get through with that, I'm going to show you how you can customize the out-of-the-box cubes, add a couple KPIs using the Jet Data Manager, with the end goal being that all of your custom metrics exist in either a pivot table or for view in Power BI. So that's the road plan. That's the road map. That's the plan. Again, my name's Jay Wilson. If you like what you see, feel free to reach out to me directly at jae@onyxreporting.com if you have any further demo, training, service, or support requirements for your Jet Professional or Jet Enterprise implementation. Right then, let's get started. So this is a version of the income statement report that I built for my client. Obviously, it's cut down to kind of highlight the important stuff, and also we're looking at Cronus data, right? The fake database. But in this column here, and this is, I think, pretty typical of many income statement reports, we're showing what was the actual activity for a month, and then what was the actual activity year to date. And sometimes you'll see it previous current month, and then the previous year, same month last year, and maybe a percent variance, or maybe you'll do a comparison against budget. But what I really liked that my client asked for is they asked to see these numbers as a percent of revenue. So off to the side, each GL account is divided by total revenue. Which I thought was a pretty slick thing to do. Think about all of your expenses in terms of percentage of revenue. Pretty interesting. If I just happened to use this date in 2016 because I know that's a date that I have data for in NAV. But if I change it to 5/1/2016 or something like this, obviously, right, this calculates the end of the previous month, and this calculates month to year to date. Okay, in any event, I'm just going to press Control tilde so we can see the types of functions we're using. You can see here we're not using replication. We have a bunch of GL accounts listed out. Then we're using Jet functions, NL first and NL sum, to calculate the name of the GL account as well as the actuals. And then we're using standard Excel math, this if error function, and division, really, to calculate my percentage. Pretty straightforward stuff. I think easily 30%, possibly more, of the time I spend doing report development for clients is somewhere around financials, a lot of times around trying to get some insight into your expense reporting, and variations of this theme I think are pretty common. And that's great. We're using Jet Professional. We're connecting directly to a NAV database. I think that works for a lot of users, and it will continue to work for a lot of users. But kind of the downside of using Jet Professional to build a structured report like this is that it is, in fact, structured. you don't have a lot of flexibility, or rather it would take more work and effort if you said, hey, you know what, Jay, I would love to see this filtered by department, or maybe I would like to see a rolling 12 months instead of seeing year to date, right? Any format is theoretically possible, but changing the format does require a good amount of work and effort, and depending on how good you are at Jet Professional, it can take anywhere from, you know, half an hour to an hour to multiple days even of kind of struggling around and messing with things. Which I think is kind of the upsell or the selling point for many people of Jet Enterprise. When you have Jet Enterprise and when you have a cube, that kind of gives you the ability to do your reporting or your analytics kind of in a pivot table, you have the benefit of flexibility. So here, let me reset my pivot table so we can start from scratch. This is the standard, let me make sure that statement is true. I was going to say this is a standard Jet project. Do a quick refresh here. Standard, straightforward, out of the box. Let's just toss an amount and see what happens. When I toss an amount, my pivot table says, oh yeah, the sum of all your transactions and NAV sum up to 0. I'm no accountant, but I hear double entry accounting. It's working the way it's supposed to. Let's slice this by the GL account dimension. GL account, where are you? ABCDFG. Ha. Okay. Any of these guys, these are going to be dimensions. Let me toss in my chart of accounts. One of the nice things about using the chart of accounts dimension is that it rolls up, say, liabilities into short-term liabilities and then into the individual GL accounts. We'll call this a ragged dimension because, you know, how many degrees of drill through is not necessarily consistent. It's not 1, 2, or 3 levels of grouping within your GL accounts. Within the chart of accounts hierarchy. We're off on a tangent. We can show amount by the chart of accounts. One thing to understand, though, is you don't have to use this hierarchy. You don't have to use this roll-up. If I look under more fields, a lot of times you'll find some other interesting things, like you can, for example, say, oh, I want to filter by or arrange my report by just GL account numbers, and then I don't have that roll-up anymore. And also, I only have amounts posted to actual posting accounts. I don't see the end total or begin total accounts. I can also use the income balance dimension level or dimension attribute in order to look at just income statement accounts or balance sheet accounts. Given that I'm building a report that's supposed to recreate an income statement, I am going to actually move income balance up to the filters area. And let me put my chart of accounts hierarchy back in because I just like it better. Okay, I've moved income balance up here to the filters area. When I click the drop down now, instead of showing assets and liabilities as well as income statement, I'll just choose income statement as filter, and now I'm just looking at income statement accounts. Very exciting. You'll notice right away that the amount is inverted. Revenue is showing up as a negative number. Costs are showing up as a positive number. And my grand total is negative, and hopefully I turn to profit. So hopefully, well, ideally, the display amount would be an inverted, just multiplied by -1. But going back to this percent of revenue idea or percent of revenue metric, a lot of times what I'll see people do is they'll say, oh yeah, well here's my pivot table, but this metric that I need doesn't exist, so I'm going to use equals cell reference divided by cell reference. You'll start seeing some of this gnarly action, and I don't like it at all because it doesn't drag or it doesn't work like you expect cell references to work. Here I did, I inserted my function and I did fill through, but each of these functions is not a cell reference. It's actually a get pivot data function, and it's saying go to this pivot data, grab the measure amount for this GL account. That's why this cell reference thing doesn't work. So then you see people do it the manual way, and they'll say, oh, I need to take cost and divide it by revenue. And then I need to take operating expenses divided by revenue. And that's how I'm going to get that's how I'm going to get it to look the way I want it to. And of course, we'll format this as a %. Right? And then you would go on ad nauseum. And this is kind of good. I mean, at the end of the day, it gets you the percentage that you're looking for. But again, back to the downsides, as soon as you change the structure of your pivot table, you're like, oh, I want to expand the cost node and see individual accounts, right? Then this isn't true anymore because this is still looking at 8,000 divided by 6,100, which is not necessarily the cost of retail. Right? These numbers didn't change, and it certainly didn't fill all the way through. Okay. So I think that's a little bit of a bummer. Having functions or formulas rather outside of your pivot table, I personally do not recommend this. And in fact, in an earlier tutorial video I did a couple weeks, maybe even months ago now, I showed you how once you get your pivot table laid out the way you want it to, you can go here to Analyze, OLAP Tools, and Convert to Formulas. When you convert your pivot table into formulas, then instead of having a pivot table anymore, you actually have legitimate Excel functions, in this case cube member and cube value. Your get pivot data function doesn't work anymore, but you can do equals this divided by that, and it will be proper cell references. Because we're not working with the pivot table anymore, we're just working with any other function in a spreadsheet. Now I can take this and drag it through, and it kind of works the way I expected it to. And that's great. I'm going to undo these changes and go back to my pivot table, and then swap over to this page where I actually have some get pivot data functions set up, but I'm getting £NA. What are you unhappy about? Oh, I know, because the connection doesn't exist anymore. Don't do it. Oh, no. I lied. I'm just going to delete this page. My demo page broke. I'm going to make a copy of it. And let's call this cube value. And again, I'm just going to convert this into cube value. Put in my cell references divided by this. Okay, so like I said earlier this year, I did a pretty good tutorial, I thought, about using cube value functions hooked up to your Jet Enterprise cubes as a way of creating structured reports that look more like this, right, where it's all laid out and static, and allows you to create your custom metrics without having to fiddle around with a bunch of pivot tables. Okay. And it's good, right? Any of these options, depending on where you stand and what your requirements are, any of these options could be appropriate for you. However, that said, me personally, I always recommend to my clients, hey, you bought Jet Enterprise and the financials, they work beautifully out of the box, but you should customize it according to your individual reporting requirements. So if your organization uses amount as a % of revenue as a metric, or if you're looking at doing, say, some sort of productivity analysis where you want to see your various expense accounts divided by, I don't know, salary, wages, or something along those lines, right? These are metrics you should build into your Jet Data Manager. Not because I said it's the right thing to do, but also because it gives you more flexibility in terms of what tools you can use for visualizing your data. I know many of you are talking about or looking at Power BI, and everybody's saying, oh yeah, Jet Enterprise, it works great with Power BI, sort of, kind of. it doesn't work sort of kind of great with Power BI. It works very well. But you do have to make sure that all of your custom metrics exist in the cubes, because when you go to Power BI, you cannot create custom calculations within Power BI if you're pointed at an SSAS multidimensional cube and using the live connector. There are a lot of caveats there, and please feel free to email me at jae@onyxreporting.com if you have questions about these caveats I just mentioned. But in any event, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you how to implement this metric, percent of total revenue, in the JET Data Manager. And the first thing you need to do in order to figure out how to implement a custom metric is you really have to have a good idea of what pieces do you need to have in order to come up with this final KPI. So if I'm talking about amount as a percent of total revenue, the two pieces of well, couple things that I need. One, this is not required, but we kind of agreed earlier that we wanted to invert the sign of income statement accounts. That's one thing we'd like to do, is multiply amount times -1 if it's an income statement account. If it's a balance sheet account, don't do anything. Okay, another thing we need to do is we need to be able to calculate total revenue. What is, I'm not going to call it total revenue, I'll just call it, what is revenue amount? Okay, so that is a measure that we need. And then the last thing we need to do is we need division. We need amount divided by revenue amount. And that will be our amount as a percent of revenue. We need these individual pieces or additional pieces. If you want to be able to, in our income statement, do this other column where we have a year-to-date number, well, for starters, in your standard pivot table, in your standard JET Enterprise project, yes, you do have amount and you do have amount year-to-date. I can drop that in there. However, you'll notice when I just drop an amount, nothing happens, and that the reason why is because you haven't defined a year. You haven't identified a period to look at. So I'm going to go in and I'll add posting date YQMD, and maybe I'll choose, what did I say last time, 2016, May 2016. Okay, now amount has a value, amount year to date has a value, but amount does not because there's no data in May 2016. If I set it to January 2016, I'll see data in both columns. Of course, it's the same, and all this tells me is all of my activity took place in 2016 Jan. It's a fake database, limited data, you get the idea. But in my income statement, in order to show year-to-date actuals and percent of sales, actuals as a percent of sales or actuals as a percent of revenue, I'll also need revenue amount year-to-date, and then I'll need another division for amount year-to-date divided by revenue amount year-to-date. That's a 5. That's the fifth thing. Okay? So the number of measures that you have to create does add up, and it's really helpful if you kind of can think about it as, I don't know if you want to say Jenga or Tetris or some sort of thing that blocks where you build on top of each other, Legos. It really helps if you can deconstruct this metric amount as a percent of revenue into individual component pieces like this, and you can just stack one piece on top of the other. All right, let's do it. Here's a JET Data Manager. Actually, I lied. Before we go into the JET Data Manager, you do need to be able to define, okay, what is an income statement account? And for this, if you are not comfortable with MDX, if you don't off top know what MDX is, I do continue to recommend that you look in a pivot table. Take your pivot table, make it look the way you want it to. So in this case, I'm going to put income balance here under rows, and if you look carefully, you can see, okay, I've got a grouping for income statement accounts, I've got another grouping for balance sheet accounts, and now I need to say, okay, what does it mean to be an income statement account? And again, if you convert to formulas, this is pretty swell. You can see here, this is MDX, and this is what it means to be an income statement account. If the income balance field has the value 0 on the GL account dimension, then you're an income statement. And if you're a 1, you're a balance sheet. I want to undo the changes on this page so I can still have my pivot table in here. I'll just type it out again. Come back, pivot table. There you are. All right, so what I say, if you're a 1, you're a balance sheet. If you're a 2, you're an income statement. Or sorry, if you're a 0, you're an income statement. I guess we would then also need to know, what does it mean to be revenue? There is a member in the GL account dimension called on the chart of accounts for all of the revenue accounts. That's this guy here, right? Another way of saying it is there is a roll-up account, or there is a begin total account in NAV 6100 that identifies all of the totaling account for revenue. Okay. Now we're going to have to get creative in the JET Data Manager. For right now, I'm just going to tackle inverting the sign of the income statement accounts. And what I'll do is, instead of changing the amount measure, I'm going to create a new calculated measure called display amount, or let's call it amount display so it sorts properly. Okay, amount display, I want it formatted like so, and it's a finance transaction, and the display amount is the same thing as amount. Now I can't just do times -1, because then everything will be multiplied by -1. I only want it to be -1 if you're an income statement account, and not if you're a balance sheet account. So for that little bit, I'm going to have to use what's called a scope statement, which we'll get to later. Right now, I'm just going to make the display amount the same as amount. Now, because this is a calculated measure, I can right-click and reapply script commands. And then when I go to my pivot table, if I refresh my pivot table, I should have a new measure called display amount, which, as I said, is going to end up being, let me take out year to date, it's going to end up being the same as amount with, just slightly different formatting, but it's the same thing, right? The numbers are the same. The values are still the same. Okay. And then let's calculate revenue amount using the display amount. Now, I'm not going to lie, for MDX, it really doesn't hurt to do a Google search sometimes, or have a trusty consultant on hand who can tell you, hey, this is how you write the MDX for the thing you're trying to do. And for calculating revenue amount, the expression that we're looking for is an open parentheses. I'm looking for this guy, and I could just copy and paste, and then I need a comma, and then I need the display amount. I think that's the syntax that we need for showing revenue amount. And I'll press OK and reapply script commands. Let's pop back over to our pivot table and let's see if we did the right thing. Let's refresh. Let's find revenue amount. There it is. Drop it into our report. And on every row, it shows 99,620, which is actually correct. the revenue amount for 2016 is that number. And so having it the same value in every column, while you think to yourself, Jay, that can't possibly be what you want, it's not wrong, right? Because I want the revenue amount to always be revenue regardless of which GL account you're slicing the pivot table by. And if you look at the data like this, you're right, it doesn't make sense. But if I take out the chart of accounts, I still get the right number as what was my revenue. So I have the starting point or the start of a KPI, a performance indicator, like what was my revenue month over month? And you don't have to slice it by all of the GL accounts. You don't have to filter by GL account. You could just say, show me revenue amount over time. And of course, I just don't have much data. Oh yeah, okay. How has my revenue changed, or how much revenue did I earn on any given day, right? Because I have this, measure revenue amount, I can see that without having to go in and manually apply filters and say, what is revenue again? Which account number is it? Blah, blah, blah. All right, we're almost there. I said we need to have revenue amount. Now we're going to just take amount and divide it by revenue amount. We're going to do some division. Now, division in MDX is a standard business function. All of these blue guys here are business functions. And somewhere, do I have a budget variance percent? Budget variance percent is a blue guy. It is a business function. And if I open up the business function, it is the snippet called division. And you could just say, you know what, guys, I want to take X and divide it by Y. But they use this if function in front of it as a means of checking for, does the denominator exist? Because if you know from Excel, and in fact in this solution, I use an if error to say, if this divided by this returns an error, return a 0. In what instance would you get an error? You get an error if you try to divide by 0. So in the JET Data Manager or in MDX, a common solution for accommodating for the possibility that you're dividing by 0 is to use an if function. In any event, you should hopefully, if the people who installed your JET Data Manager did it properly, you should hopefully have business functions installed. And if you don't have business and functions installed, I've done a tutorial on it in the past, but because this is a new install on my system, I cheated and it did not install the business functions. I'll write it out by hand. So I'm going to create a calculated measure. And the business function says if the display amount has a value, then do the display amount divided by revenue amount. If there is no if there is no display amount, then return a null. So in this case, I'm not worried about dividing by 0. I'm not worried about my revenue being 0. I'm worried about there not being an amount. This is percent, so I'll make sure to show 2 decimal places and tack a percent sign on at the end. I think that's the right spelling. Let's see how I did. Go back to my pivot table, do a quick refresh. I should have, if I did it correctly, a new measure called new. I forgot to name it. Let me rename my measure because new is silly. We're going to call this amount as a percent of revenue. Let's reapply script commands. new goes away, but the measure amount as a percent of revenue shows up. And let's see if this makes sense. Is revenue 100% of revenue? It sure is. Our costs, I have a lot of costs. The costs are greater than revenue amount, so having that be 111% makes sense. This is 1,000 divided by 99, just eyeballing it. Sure, makes sense to me. Let me take out my date filter here. If I do all dates. Total income as a percent of revenue is 0.73. That doesn't sound good. But these numbers still hold up even as I slice across different dates. Awesome. At this point, you know what? I don't need to show revenue amount, so I'll just take that out of my report. And that's good. I'm left with that calculation I wanted. I do have this division by 0 because I have no revenue under balance sheets. So let's tidy that up a bit. Revenue amount. Oops, sorry, this guy. I'm just going to do another nested if. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to do another if. I'm going to solve this problem of the null. I'm going to solve the problem of the num, this pound num, because we're looking at balance sheet accounts. I'm going to solve that a different way. All right. So this is not done. I haven't inverted the sign yet, but I do have my amount as a percent of revenue. And I also need to do my year-to-dates. Okay. So year-to-date is another set of business functions. And in fact, if I look here under amount year-to-date, I can see it's, again, in blue. And here I can see, you know, how is it parameterized? How is this business function parameterized? Down here are where you can pass in various parameters using a drop-down. Super easy, super flexible. But because I don't have business functions installed and I need to make a new year-to-date measure, I'm just going to copy the MDX here and recycle it. So let's create a new amount, a calculated measure, and I will call it revenue amount year-to-date. And I'm going to keep everything the same except for this is going to be my revenue amount. Yep. Let's just test it out and make sure it works. Okay. I'm going to take out these two guys and toss in, let me refresh my pivot table. Revenue amount, toss you in, and what period did I have a different set of data in? December 2015. Yeah, okay, so this does generate different numbers. Good. All right. So it's all looking good so far. I've got my revenue amount, and now it's rinse, wash, and repeat. I'm going to do my division function again, and I'm feeling particularly lazy, so let me just copy this and add a new calculated measure, and it's amount year-to-date as a percent of revenue. And again, all I have to do, because I have to do amount year-to-date display. I didn't make an amount year-to-date. Shame on me. Revenue amount year-to-date. I need to make an amount year-to-date display. Yeah, let's copy this guy. Okay. You know what? I'm feeling cheeky. I'm going to redefine the existing amount year-to-date to use my display amount. Shouldn't do it, but I did. All right, I'm lazy. Anyway, good. Then I can change amount year-to-date. I'm cheating, I know. Nope, you're fine. Where is my division? This guy. Just use amount year-to-date. It's just as good. And reapply script commands, refresh. And do I have amount year-to-date as a percent of revenue? Where'd you go? Oh, I didn't put you in a folder. That's fine. It didn't work. Let's go back and check my spelling. Oops. I didn't create this measure. Success. We still have that pound num issue, which we're going to address shortly. But yeah, now we have our percents of revenue, amount year-to-date as a percent of revenue. And again, just eyeballing it, does it hold up? Is 111 greater than 99? Yeah, a little bit more. This is what happens when you don't put your formatting in place, right? Because I just have a really long number. So let me go back to my amount here. Let me put in a format string. And let me assign it to the right folder. Looks much better. Good. All right. So we've gotten to the end of this. The only thing we haven't done is invert the sign of income statement accounts. And just in case you forgot and in case you lost the plot about why we want to do that, it's so that when I show display date, that the income statement numbers are inverted, but the balance sheet numbers are not. And if you hear what I just said, again, I'm trying to change the calculation depending on which slice of the cube I'm working with. Does that make sense? I need to change how the display amount is calculated depending on if I'm looking at an income statement or a balance sheet account. Now to do that, you're going to have to use what's called a scope statement. And again, there's not enough time in the world, and I certainly don't necessarily have the expertise to give a thorough presentation on scope statements, and you can definitely Google this to get started. But what I will do is, I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to copy this guy here. Every scope statement begins with a scope, and you have to say what you want to scope. And I'm going to say that I'm scoping the display measure, amount display. And for every open scope, you must have an end scope. Let's get rid of you. Then within here, I'm going to do another scope. And I guess you could think of it as a nested scope. And now once I'm inside the scope statement, now I can say what this is. This is equal to amount times -1. Because I want to invert the sign if the income balance is a 0. I'm going to copy this whole section again. And say, hey, if you're a 1, don't multiply by -1. You're just measure amount. All right, I think I did that correctly, so let me reapply script commands, go into Excel. All right, currently this number is negative. Hopefully when I refresh, oh no, I did something wrong. Hopefully when I refresh it's going to work, or you have a spelling mistake. Let's see if I can find it. And the semicolon. Every statement in a scope statement needs to end with a semicolon. That always gets me. This is why I'm not a computer scientist. Perfect. So now you can see the amounts, the display amount, the signs have inverted. Now what's nice about this kind of modular Lego brick design that I talked about earlier is any measure that uses the display amount will have updated as well. So now these percentages, the signs will have inverted, or well, at least they'll still be correct. And the same for revenue amount. Here, revenue amount is a positive number because I'm using the display amount. I haven't fixed this issue here. And again, this is another scoping statement waiting to happen, right? If you're in the balance sheet area, you know, what are we going to do about revenue? Well, revenue is a 0, and that is actually correct. So what am I going to do about the calculation for my percents? I'm just going to put in another scope statement here. Copy this. And we're going to apply this to the amount percent. Where is the amount percent? Amount as percent of revenue. If you're an income statement account, can I just do use amount percent of revenue, and if you're in a balance sheet account, then you're equal to null. I'm not sure that's going to work. We'll find out. Oh no, spelling errors. It has to end with a semicolon. Okay, I'm not going to lie, I did pause the recording while I sorted through the problem. I don't like people having to sit, watch me debug. I did get rid of the error, and once again, the problem was just a missing semicolon. So here, I missed a semicolon right there. So again, statement stands. Every statement has to, every statement in your scope statement has to end with a semicolon, otherwise you'll get some form of error because carriage return is not the same as a semicolon in MDX. All right. We would obviously do the same thing for the revenue, sorry, the amount as a year-to-date, amount year-to-date as a percent of revenue. You'd have the same scope statement set up, but just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over that. What we have done so far is we've looked at four different ways of building a report that has a custom KPI in it. custom KPI, some sort of metric, a division or something like that. We looked at just using Jet reports, Jet Professional, to put a function together and extract data directly out of nav, and then use Excel functions, standard Excel functionality to calculate your metric. Straightforward, out of the box, works great. I talked about already the model of using a pivot table and then using the get pivot data method of putting your metric, the measure in place. And I already said I don't like this method because it's not flexible. The function exists outside of the pivot table, which means as soon as you change what you show in the pivot table, this data is no longer correct. Or at least it's not dynamic. It doesn't stretch and move as the pivot table changes shape. And in fact, what's also particularly obnoxious is if I try to move date YQMD into columns, if I try to take advantage of pivot tables as a flexible analytic tool, Excel will complain because it says, hey, there's something in column D and you're going to replace it. And now it's really, really gone. So again, me personally, I don't prefer this model of using get pivot data to create calculations pointed at pivot tables. I did tell you that you can convert your pivot table into cube value and cube member functions, and that's fine because this is static. This won't try to dynamically expand. It will only show the data that's in this set of cube member reports, and then you can use your cell reference, the normal, air quotes, the normal way to create your various metrics. And this is good. It gets you closer to the functionality that you had here with Jet, but then the downside is that you've lost the flexibility. You can't have that, oh, I want to rearrange it, I want to change the structure of it. You lost everything that makes a pivot table great. So we said, okay, we'll implement all of your measures in your in Jet Data Manager so that this amount as a percent of revenue is as flexible as you are. You can say, hey, I want to take this metric and slice it by global dimension 1 code. I've got an if error situation going on, or a divide by 0 error going on here, but the metric, it still works. Again, we have to clean this up. This is just a case of, how do you accommodate for dividing by 0? And I guess I just didn't do a good enough job. Okay, but all of that can be fixed in MDX, in your scope statement, or in the way you define your function. Then the last piece becomes, once you've implemented all of this in Excel, in the Jet Data Manager, you can take this and pull it into PowerBI. I promise it's going to open shortly. Sorry, hold on. Need to close this guy. Pull it up here. Okay. So here we are in Power BI. I'm going to go get data from analysis services. And where's my Jet cubes? Okay. Here's the key right here. If you use import, it's good, but Connect Live, I think, is the way you're seeing most of the demos. When you see Jet Enterprise pointed at Power BI, or Power BI pointed at Jet Enterprise, I think most of the times you see them demo using the Connect Live. And there are some caveats there. In order to use Connect Live, you must be on SQL Server version 2012, Service Pack 3, something to that extent. So if you're on 2008, this option won't work for you. You have to use import. And if you are in 2012 but haven't kept up to date on your SQL Server updates, well, it won't work for you either, but that's just a service pack away. In any event, with Connect Live, what this will allow you to do is it will allow you to select your cube and see the entire model here. In this functionality, I've talked about it before, but it's new-ish to Power BI as of last year. So it's been around for a while, but not forever. The visualizations, the way it looks or works in Power BI is the same way it's going to work or look in Excel. So again, you will just see the number 0 until you slice by some sort of a GL account dimension. Right? And now all of a sudden we start seeing some numbers and we start seeing percentages, and from here we can take it and run with it. You want to see it as a graph? Fine. You want to see a pie chart? Put it in a pie chart. If you want to see it as a line bars, bar lines, you can do that as well. I'm going to leave it to you to kind of explore Power BI, but the thing I really wanted to drive home was that the only reason this metric exists in Power BI is because I previously defined it in the Jet Data Manager. They say Jet Data Manager is a no-code solution, right? You've got a stock data warehouse out of the box, and it's perfect. I think it's true. It does work out of the box. But I would also say that in order to get the metrics that are important to your organization, the KPIs, to really make it actionable data or actionable information instead of just a bunch of numbers, you do have to make a little bit of effort to customize the Jet Data Manager, and that's where somebody who knows a little bit of SQL, someone who knows a little bit of MDX, someone who knows a little bit of SSAS can really bring value to your team. And that takes us to the end of our presentation. My name is Jay Wilson. Thank you so much for joining us. In this presentation, we talked a little bit about some different models of creating reports, either using the Jet Professional add-in, using pivot table, cube value, or customizing new measures in the Jet Data Manager with an end goal of being able to see that all in Power BI. I am available for freelance consulting, training, services, and support. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at jae@onyxreporting.com. Thanks so much, guys. I'll catch you later.